It's great to be back at NACIS in person after a good many years. I'm Lauren Tierney. I'm a senior graphics reporter at the Washington Post, and today I'm going to talk about elevating your Halo game. Halo being text masks and label masks for your maps. And I want to thank Amy, who gave the first presentation today about accessible maps. Like, a lot of this is going to tie into that. That presentation was awesome, and I could nerd out about that for hours. So first, just to get some things out of the way, not related to either of these things, halos. So anyway, so today I'm going to talk about a few tricks to essentially do halos or type masking for your maps in quick, efficient ways. This is something that's kind of like, you could go down a rabbit hole with creating these really refined, fine-tuned type halos, type masking. And I'll touch on that a little bit, but the focus of this is going to be on doing it in very efficient ways and based on different mediums and how to approach that for different maps. So the first one I'm going to talk about is large batch halos. So this is what I refer to it when it's just, how can we make halos for as many labels as possible in the quickest way possible? So think about it as you're making a batch of like 20 batches of chocolate chip cookies. You want to have the recipe repeatable. You probably want to make you can make change the size of the batch, etc., and scale up the ingredients and whatnot as you need. Same with the number of map labels that you have. So for this first example, I'm going to talk about, or use this example from a map we did for Hurricane Fiona a couple weeks back. This is mapping susceptibility to landslides triggered by intense rainfall on the island. And at the bottom here, I'm going to try to track what changes are happening on the map. So I know the screen's a little bit hard to see, and so down at the bottom, we'll track what's changing on the map for the examples I'm going to show. So for this map right now, it doesn't have any halos or type masking. And so the labels are readable. They're a dark saturated color. They're darker than the darkest data, so they're readable kind of, but they're not very clear. Especially some of the ones up in the mountainous areas where landslide risk is highest, which you could argue are probably some of the more important ones to highlight because they're the populated areas most at risk. So how can we make these labels more legible in a very quick way? So all I'm going to do for this first step is add a white stroke. So just adding the white stroke already just pops those labels and makes them a lot more legible. This is something where, I'm keeping this very broad in terms of software and what you're using it in, and I'll talk about the different mediums later. But this is something that in a lot of different softwares, a lot of different platforms, you can at the very least add a white stroke. So even adding just a simple white stroke can make those labels pop, or even if your background on your map isn't white, maybe if it's a darker background color, maybe even a black stroke for those. But one thing that we can do to refine these a little bit further, so we just added a white stroke to every single layer. One thing we can do to refine this further is to add a bit of transparency. So we're going to add transparency to all of these labels. So this is about, if I remember correctly, about 60% transparency to every label on this map. So every label was selected, added a white stroke, and then added transparency. And it creates a little bit of a smoother look when you add that transparency. Also, in places where the landslide risk is highest, you can also see that there's data underneath those labels as well. So it is a little bit muted, but it's that give and take balance of having the label readable or legible, but still showing the data underneath. And that's it for this map. So 2 steps, and that's kind of what I call that large batch halo process. So this is where we started, and then this is where we went in 2 steps. So we added a white stroke and added transparency to every single label. So this can carry over to web mapping if all your labels are in one kind of group and you're applying one style to those, or if you're working in Illustrator, if you're working in Photoshop, etc. So this is that example of those large batch halos in terms of the quickest halos we can make. And we do this a lot at the Post in that we have to work really quickly a lot of the times. And while in a past life I would spend hours doing type halos, which I really enjoy and can nerd out on, I can't can't always do that now. So these are ways that on our team we create these halos to make maps more legible for the web and print. And then next I'll go through like the small batch halos. So my thinking for this is essentially you've got that cookie recipe, but say you want to make chocolate chip cookies and like M&M cookies or something. So essentially like you have this base to start with, these base steps to start with, but then you can change it a little bit as needed versus like making one chocolate chip cookie, one M&M cookie, one chocolate chip cookie, et cetera, et cetera. And so approaching from that large batch perspective of like addressing all the labels, but then fine-tuning as you go and as you want. So for this example, I'm going to use this map on the Mexican wolf current range that we published a couple months ago, if I remember correctly, a couple months. And so for this first map, there's no halos on this one. So there's a lot going on in this one. You could argue maybe a little bit more than the last one. We've got terrain, we've got national parks, national forests, we've got the Mexican wolf current range, we've got political labels as well. There's a lot going on in this map. And again, you can read most of the labels, but some of them are pretty hard to see, and especially when they're overlapping all the mountains, which we want to have because we're showing a wildlife species range, so we want to see where it is in the physical landscape. And so to start this off, we're just going to approach it from that kind of large batch perspective. So grab every label and applied a white stroke. So for some of these, it makes them more legible. For others, it actually makes them a little bit less legible. It almost adds a little bit too much busyness with that first approach. And so we're taking that first step, but we can refine it further. So doing the same step we did last time, adding a little bit of transparency. And so this is just that white stroke with transparency, but it already kind of smooths out that contrast between the background and the halo and the label to make it a little bit more legible. And also with that transparency, again, it allows that data and information to come through a little bit so that you can see what's going on underneath. But we can take this a little bit further. So for that first map, that was one that was done really quick in a breaking news situation. This one was a map that had a few weeks to make, and so there's more time, depending on the project, there's more time to refine these halos. So taking a step back on this one, and instead of using a white stroke, using a light tan stroke. So rather than using kind of that white quickest approach, using essentially a color that is the most common color in your base map. So that's why I selected the light tan in this one. So if the background of this map was mostly black, I'd probably want to select like a black halo for behind my text labels. But in this case, taking a step further to change it to that light tan, which is the most common color in the base map. And then taking that additional step we did before, adding some transparency. It's a bit smoother feel than when we had the white outlines as well. And so that's kind of like a little bit more steps than the first one we did. But again, because we have more time and we can refine this a bit further, we're going to do a few more adjustments. And so another approach you can do with type halos to make them make your labels a little bit more legible. And this one is where it gets a little bit more into what your software can do, what you're working with. So you can add a blur to the stroke to kind of smooth this out. So this is a map with a lot of information going on in the background. You've got the mountains, you've got the terrain. And so having a little bit of a smoother halo might help it blend into the background a little bit more. So for this next one, just add a little blur to the stroke around that. And again, this is pretty like software dependent. So in this, I'm using Illustrator. You can do this in Photoshop. When you get into web and interactive mapping, this is a bit trickier. In some platforms, you can trick it a little bit with maybe like some layered strokes and whatnot, but it's not always possible. And so adding that blur, to me, the labels that are much easier to read are some of the ones that are near the Mexican wolf current range. They become a little bit clearer because it's a little less busy with not introducing a new hard edge to the map. And then, so we've added this blur, and so now kind of taking a look at this map and seeing, what else can we refine? So we've changed the color, we've added a blur. Now the next step I suggest is looking at, are there any label halos that are distracting? Is there anything that's popping up more that shouldn't be? Is there anything that's distracting from the main label, which in this case, the most important label is the Mexican wolf current range, because that's the highlight of the map and the story. And so looking at this map, those 2 national forest labels that sit in that purple area, they're standing out a bit more than they need to. And so this is where we kind of get into like the small batch area of just, rather than selecting all the labels, selecting those 2 labels and changing them to like a light purple that better matches that background that they're sitting on. So essentially, for all the halos on this map, it's using 2 colors, everything has transparency, and everything has a blur. So this is where we started, and then this is where we went in about 4-ish steps, if you don't count kind of the back and forth between colors. And going back and forth, it just creates a bit crisper map, and also it's much easier to read the labels, which are very important for the purposes of the story. One thing I do want to highlight, though, this is more like software dependent, but especially for those using AI to HTML to publish maps online, one thing to keep in mind is if you add these fancy things to strokes like blurs and different colors and whatnot, they often drop out when you run the script. And so this is kind of a hacky way to do it, but one thing I've done for kind of these longer term projects is actually creating a shape behind the text and blurring that shape, adding a color and transparency to it. So it's a similar process to the stroke, but it's building something that can be baked into the image. And so it's a little niche depending on the workflow, but wanted to show this example for people working in the AI to HTML environment. So things to keep in mind, just because you can blur your halos doesn't mean you need to. I love adding all kinds of soft glows to maps, but you don't always need to. So if the map is vector or hard edges, so sometimes it's like a web, like street map, a lot of locator maps too. If they have hard edges, keep a simple stroke. That can often keep a little bit crisper appearance without your map getting kind of ghosty feeling. Also, remember, sometimes you don't need halos. So if a halo makes your map less legible, that's not the goal. The goal of the halo is to make your map more legible. So if it's making it less legible, continue to refine them, or maybe consider getting rid of them. And then if a halo covers up critical map information, so if it's safety information on trail map, etc., consider removing the halo, adding transparency, just to keep the information more visible underneath. I did a presentation last year about how to edit your own maps, and it goes into some stuff about like label placement and how to move your labels for legibility too. So I won't get into that today, but you can also move your labels as well. And then for very time-intensive approaches, you can halo by the letter if you want to. You can do manual halo painting or blending. Example of that, Photoshop. Did this in a past life, and it's like I could nerd out about it for days, but we often don't have that time. And it's also, do you need to do these things? If you can get a really crisp halo that is allowing your labels to really pop and be readable to your audience, maybe you don't need to dive into all those really nitpicky halo approaches, depending on the project. And then these are just some guidelines for that we follow. So kind of reviewing you can add the outline, you can add the blur, making sure it matches your background color, and also being careful with the color you choose too. If you start to go closer to the text color, you get these weird blurs that happen that are not so great. For map medium considerations, I touched on some of these before, but selecting one halo style for all labels is sometimes your only option in web and interactive. For HTML, make sure to remember that your strokes can often get dropped out if you're styling in Illustrator, so apply CSS to style for halos or create masks. And then for static maps, you can really kind of run wild. If it's going to get baked into an image, you can just continue with it, but remember, you don't have to overdo it. There's a lot of these batch tricks that you can apply and get great results. And then for hand-drawn maps, this is something I tinkered with the other day. I was just playing around with watercolor. I am very much a novice in all things hand-drawn maps, and so this was purely experiment, but essentially what I did is I recreated a couple label examples, and I tried different things of using watercolor, and I'm sharing this in that, like, I did no research on this, so there's probably expert ways to do this, but I wanted to share this in the effort of, like, let's explore new things without feeling like we have to be an expert first. I'm not up here saying I'm an expert at watercolor, but it's fun to try out, and like everyone should feel free to try this stuff out. Don't feel like you need to be an expert first. So these are just some examples. I'll just flip through to show. Did some water first, water off the paint, not so good. Don't paint the label, it's kind of clunky. Remove the paint, it was kind of a mess. And then I think this is the one I was happiest with, but I would love to hear more thoughts on, hand-drawn map label type halos. These are some of the tools I used. And yeah, please come up and ask questions. Please come up and talk, especially new folks. Welcome to NACIS. And thank you all for your time.